Good evening, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Season 2020 update, part of the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for October 5th, 2020, recorded near 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. Our main focus today is going to be Hurricane Delta. Now, Delta has maximum sustained winds right now about 65 miles per hour, but recon plane did find that it was a little bit higher. We'll talk about that there in a moment. We can see a very impressive convective burst, deep convective burst that has been rotating around these thunderstorms that have gone up from earlier today. They have started to rotate their way around and basically close off an eye, kind of an eye and eye wall in here. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but the radar imagery coming out of Cancun did suggest that there was a closed symmetrical eye wall. The recon vortex data message from the NOAA plane from earlier was a closed eye wall and also a little bit elliptical, but mostly symmetrical. So that is not the best of news. And we can see that from earlier, we did have maybe some pulsing indicating that there might have been some dry air that actually did get entrained, but now the storm is actually looking very decent, and we will probably start to see an eye pop out later tonight or probably during the day tomorrow. Now, if we take a look here at the latest recon plane that passed through again, the winds here on the northeast side obviously going to be stronger, hurricane force flight level winds. In only a very small area, we can see that there wasn't a large expansive area, but this suggests that this is a very tight circulation, a very close radius of maximum winds up there at about 75 to 80 miles per hour. And so that is certainly up there from earlier. But again, we can see that the pressure was down to about 976.9 was the kind of the first initial pass through on the extrapolated pressure. So we're going to have to see what recon finds kind of going through for the second pass to see if it's going to continue strengthening. But certainly, sustained winds now probably on the order of about 75, to 80 miles per hour. So not a whole lot different from earlier, but the storm is still trying to organize, and those winds do take a little bit of time, especially with these pressure falls. These winds are going to take a little bit more time to kind of catch up to the storm and intensify. Because it's strengthening quickly, it takes a little bit of time for those winds to actually catch up to the pressure falls. So that's just something to be mindful of. Now we can see here that this is the forecast, kind of the graphical representation of the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. A couple of differences from earlier this afternoon when we first talked. We've continued to see that these centers have reformed. This is kind of a little bit too far towards the north and east where I kind of put this and drew it in. But regardless, this is expected now. This is passing basically to the west here of the Cayman Islands, which is right here. And this will continue to track towards the north and northwest today. And then we can see here it becomes a major hurricane by tomorrow and tomorrow evening as it passes right near the northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. And this is a different forecast than what we saw earlier from this being a tropical, or basically being a tropical storm or weak hurricane passing through this region. Now, for this region, there is hurricane warnings that are in effect for both the Yucatan Peninsula coastline here and also the western tip of Cuba, as this could split the difference between there. And again, there is still the possibility that this can come right over the western part of Cuba here, or this could directly impact the Yucatan Peninsula and move over and then move back over into the open Gulf of Mexico. Now, after that time, it is expected to start weakening a little bit more in the face of dry air and shear, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But again, this is going to be a threat here for the central Gulf Coast. Really, anywhere from eastern Texas all the way through the western Florida Panhandle has to monitor this situation very carefully. Again, just because the center, quote unquote, from the Hurricane Center's forecast, basically into central Louisiana, doesn't mean that's necessarily going to happen, which we'll talk about there in a moment. Now we can see here on the H-Wharf, this is the sea surface temperatures and this is the H4 from the 18Z run from earlier. Now, if we move this out here, well, it's about 24 hours from now. You can see the storm still rapidly deepening at about 964 millibars at this point in time. Now, one of the things is that this is going to be running again into this cooler patch out across the Gulf of Mexico, and we can clearly see that here. And this is basically in response because this front has basically come down. That we had this large cold front that sagged southward over the last several days. Now that's pushed back northward, but this has left in its wake a lot of cooler waters back in through here, a lot of cool, shallow waters. So these are easily disturbed in the atmosphere, and we can see kind of some of this disturbed weather also from Gamma, which is now on this model here, 24 hours from now, sitting over basically the Bay of Campeche and near the Yucatan Peninsula coastline. Now, if we move this out further in time, we can see the storm rapidly deepens 9:35. Now, this is one of the more important things. You notice how this takes it right over the northern coast here of the Yucatan Peninsula. And if we look here on the H-Wharf, the 200 millibar winds and the kind of the wind flow, we have this big upper level low, basically this anticyclone located to the east of Florida right now. And we can see that Gamma doesn't really pop up on here, but Gamma is located somewhere in here. Tropical depression Gamma is located right there. And we can see that we're getting vertical wind shear out of the southeast, changing towards the north as kind of the time progresses, and all this dry air coming on the backside. But what we do have is a storm that is well removed here. This is we'll go out here to about 1 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we can see that this is to the east of Jamaica, or I'm sorry, west of Jamaica at this time. Now, the steering pattern, again, is going to generally be forcing a storm towards the northwest. And because now this is a stronger storm, it does have a chance to get a little bit more and deviate from that because this is stronger. So there is still an outside possibility that we might see impacts to the western part here of Cuba, and that's why there is a hurricane warning in effect for that area as well. But the general consensus today is this moves kind of on this general pattern towards the west-northwest and impacts the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula at near probably peak intensity. Now, after that point in time, we start to see what ends up happening here is in the atmosphere, we get this big upper-level anticyclone to develop over the Gulf once again. So relatively light flow, but you notice what's starting to happen here by hour 51. We have this big trough digging in, and that's the jet max right there. This is the trough axis that's kind of positioned like that. So our storm now is trying to kind of turn the ridge, kind of turn the corner from this big ridge sitting over Florida right now. And this upper level low in this trough that's sitting over Texas right now, over portions of West Texas. Now, we can see what starts to happen is this trough eventually starts to dig in a little bit more. And this ridge that's kind of positioned over here, if we actually look back at the GFS forecast, we can see what starts to happen is we get a big dominant ridge to set up basically over this region. Not a dominant ridge, but it's kind of strong enough, and we can put our arrows in there and whatnot. And you can see the flow around that ridge. It's kind of that clockwise flow around the ridge. We also have a trough that's kind of a shortwave trough that's starting to dig in through here, and we can very clearly see that start to show up here. If we go out to the 500 millibars, so if we go at about 500 millibars in the atmosphere and we look at that vorticity, we can see this big ridge right now over Florida by 72 hours and this trough that's digging in. Now, this kind of sets the ridge, this kind of sets the edge between these two kind of differential air masses, and we eventually have to have a storm that's going to try to turn in through here. It has to turn at some point. Now, whether this turn is a little bit later and eventually kind of sets up a landfall near West Louisiana and East Texas, or whether this sets up a landfall for Eastern Louisiana, or even maybe sets up a landfall for portions of Mississippi, Alabama, and the western Florida panhandle remains to be seen. There is still a lot of outcomes here with regards to where this is going to go, and a lot depends on how it interacts here with tropical depression Gamma, because now that we have a storm that's trying to pinwheel around, this might actually even stall out here for a period of time and then make a sharper turn like that. So it's not entirely unlikely to see Western Florida Panhandle right now to be impacted, but especially from Mississippi, Louisiana, you need to be monitoring this very closely, and of course, also East Texas. So there is inherent risk across the Gulf of Mexico and Gulf Coast states once again. Again, this is a very dangerous situation that we're setting up to have. But again, the immediate threat is going to be for the western part of Cuba and eventually the Yucatan Peninsula, the north coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. All right. With that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Stay safe, everyone. I'll talk to you guys again some more tomorrow.